Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Eleanor and I spoke with Charles Moore, the journalist and biographer of Margaret Thatcher.
Charles talked about what it was like to write leaders for the Telegraph, aged just 24. He talked about how he deals with the criticism following some of his most divisive columns, and he talked about how combative Margaret Thatcher could be during their interviews sometimes.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Charles Moore, welcome to Always Take Notes. I want to start the interview with 1979, which is when you joined the Telegraph as a political correspondent. And it was that year that Thatcher became Prime Minister. So I want to know, do you remember the first piece that you wrote about her? I assume you were covering her quite extensively.
Well, actually, I wasn't a political correspondent. I first joined on the diary column. So I was pitched into all sorts of stories, including political ones, of every description.
Was this the Peterborough gossip column?
Yes.
Yes.
Which was a very, gossip was not really the word for it. It was incredibly respectable, but it had a political element. I arrived in October and she'd become Prime Minister in May. And actually, she was the reason I became a journalist, because I was at university and I did the civil service exams and I got through to the final. And then Mrs Thatcher became Prime Minister and she froze recruitment to the civil service. So I couldn't go forward. So I was unemployed.
Did you tell her this when you...
No, I never did actually. So I was unemployed for a bit, and then I got a job on the Telegraph. So I'm very grateful to her for that, because I wouldn't have been well cut out to be a civil servant.
So did she make it into the Peterborough column?
Oh, yes. I mean, I don't remember doing a particular story about that, but obviously she was already the dominant figure. But at that time, remember that a large number of people thought she was going to fail, and that she wouldn't get through the next 2-3 years. And that feeling grew, actually. It wasn't so strong in 79, but it grew in 1980 and 81. So that it seemed very, and indeed was, very tense for her until Falklands victory in 82.
Could we talk about how your own career developed through the 1980s, and also how, when you started interacting professionally as a reporter with Thatcher, how did those things run in parallel?
Having done the diary column, I became briefly a sub on the Telegraph, and then I became a leader writer, and it was really only when I became a leader writer that I started to do predominantly political things. And I started to write some articles under my own name, and then just before the 83 election, I was seduced away from the Telegraph by the Spectator. I was their political columnist for the 83 election, and that meant that I followed Mrs Thatcher around on the election trail, and that was the first time I had sort of daily contact with her. I did also go with Michael Foot, the Labour leader, but mainly with her. But I didn't know her then, and I didn't even talk to her. I was just one of that sort of pack of people who are following her closely all the time. Or particularly, I remember going in the West Country, and her flying in a hovercraft and things like that, and holding fish in Padstow and so forth. And I actually met her for the first time at a dinner in 1985 in the House of Commons of a little club which she came to address, and that was my first actual encounter.
Do you remember what you spoke about? Did
yes,
you prepare
because
something?
What happened was she had just signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and I criticised her at the dinner from a sort of Thatcherite point of view, because I said, you've won the war in the Falklands for people who wish to retain their British sovereignty, but in making the Anglo-Irish Agreement, you've cut out the Unionists, you didn't consult them about the future of Northern Ireland, and you've dealt with the Irish Republic, so surely that's not a good Thatcherite thing to do. And she got very, very cross in her very characteristic way, which was to start using whatever argument came to hand and sort of beating you over the head. I mean, not literally. And she said, but you don't realise the Protestants refused to collect rubbish from Catholic dustbins. I don't know what she was particularly talking about, or whether it was true or not, but that was rather characteristic of her, that she would use the sort of example to try and squash you. And so we started off with an argument, but I noticed even then that though she was very fierce in combat, she did actually sort of enjoy it. So she didn't try to make you feel, you little worm, how dare you say anything. She was more wanting to engage with the contest.
And as someone who was on Fleet Street in the 1980s but has remained active in journalism up to the present, could you paint a picture, perhaps people who weren't working or weren't even alive then, of what journalism was like in the 70s and 80s? And with, be as sort of brutally frank, what was good about it then? What was, compared to today, what was less good?
What was good about it, particularly on the Telegraph, was a very, very strong sense of what is news, which was very carefully and efficiently collected. And it was a massive news team, both foreign and domestic. And that was all very professionally done and very accurate. What was bad about it was that in some ways it was quite narrow. Again, particularly in the Telegraph, we had no columnists in the Telegraph in those days, none, except for the marvellous fantasy columnist Peter Simple. But no people had the then proprietor didn't believe in columns. He wanted pure news, which is rather refreshing in a way, but even at the time it seemed quite odd. Also, the labour relations were absolutely appalling with the print unions and completely unreformed. The print unions were 100% male, 100% hereditary, controlled themselves so that the management could only keep going by bringing down literally suitcases with cash in them to bribe them when they were trying to go on strike in the night. All Victorian hot metal printing, literally Victorian, a lot of it. Lots of pointless industrial disputes, strikes. The unions eventually trying to control what was said in the paper, so they tried to get the leader altered if it didn't say something they liked. And this went on, and then everything... Oh, and people were terribly drunk, fantastically drunk people all the time, in a way that's just extraordinary to remember, really, how very, very drunk. Third week, a man was killed because he was a message... what they called a message boy, though he was actually about 60, and he was just very drunk and tipped over the stairs and fell to his death. That was the sort of world. People were in the pub a great deal, and as I say, virtually all male. And then it all changed dramatically because of new technology and the Thatcher union reforms. So there was the famous standoff between Rupert Murdoch and the print unions at his news site in Wapping, and he won that eventually after bitter, literally battles. And then the modern world came in, and all the papers, including the Telegraph, got new technology, moved house, so we no longer had the print at the back of the shop, as it were. It was in a different place. And we moved from, I think, having 400 printers to having about 25 overnight, because we completely got rid of the old system. And everything changed, and we were free to say what we wanted, and we were able to print efficiently and all over the place, and we started to make profits, because incredibly the Telegraph was not making a profit, though it was by miles the market leader, and this was because of all these restrictions and overmanning and union problems. And so by the end of the 80s, the Telegraph was in very good shape. I wasn't actually there until I came back to it in 90, having been away at the Spectator from 83 until then. So I watched this from a close vantage point, but I wasn't actually in it at that time.
You edited Boris Johnson when you were at the Telegraph. Mm-hmm. What are your kind of most striking memories of his copy?
Well, always late, of course. That's the single most notable. No, that's unfair. The single most notable thing about his copy was it was extremely entertaining and original. But the second most notable thing was that it was always late. And there was perhaps some relationship between the two things, because what he wanted to do was to have a sort of adrenaline going in his own system when he was writing. And also he didn't want to miss anything by being too early.
Did he want to have not enough time for it to be changed?
He wasn't terribly pernickety about whether it be changed or not. He wasn't a sort of prima donna about it, but I mean, you're right in a way, there wasn't any time to change it seriously by the time it arrived, because it was supposed to come in at, let's say, 6, and it would never ever arrive before 7:30, and sometimes it didn't arrive till 8:30, which really almost meant that you had to sort of delay printing of the paper, and was just disgraceful. So it was a constant problem. And one time I did deliberately spike his copy, though it did arrive. I had something waiting to put in its stead, because I was determined to show him, and so it did. He got very angry, but it was held out because it arrived too late, and he behaved well for about a month, and then.
What was he like in the office as a sort of personality?
Very charming. Pretty like now, really. Very charming. Fundamentally easy to get on with, but difficult to manage, if you see the difference. Full of original ideas. Very good other things as well as columns. I mean, he was a very good reporter or sketch writer or interviewer. He's very, very good. We used to do an interview, I think, for the Monday's paper, and he'd sort of go off somewhere and find someone, usually a famous person. And he, as far as I could tell, it was sort of self-starting. He didn't need much direction. And he's very enterprising. I remember him suddenly popping up in Belgrade and interviewing Slobodan Milosevic when he was the great boss man, dictator, murderous tyrant, etc. And Boris had somehow got into the room with him. And this route
that, in some ways, you share with him of at the Telegraph, then going to the Spectator, editing that at a relatively young age, coming back. Had that track been taken before you did it? Or Matthew Dancona also springs to mind.
Yes, no, I was the first Telegraph person, I think, to edit the Spectator, though maybe Nigel Lawson had been on the Sunday Telegraph. But it wasn't a particular route. It became much more of a route later, because in my time as editor of the Spectator was bought by the Telegraph. And ever since then, there's been a sort of umbilical link.
What do you remember of the website launching? I think it was the year after you joined the Telegraph. Was it?
Yeah, it was. The interesting thing is that I remember so little about it.
Oh, really?
Because
you were the first newspaper in
yes,
Europe.
I do remember it, of course, and we considered it important. But we also, our mentality was that we had to do this. And we knew it would become more important, but nevertheless, it seemed secondary, if you see what I mean. We didn't really imagine the absolute transformation. So we were actually pretty early in the game. We did well in that respect. But I don't remember people saying the online world is going to dominate everything. It was still seen as a sort of secondary question.
Well, it's still seen like that, I think, by a lot of old school print journalists, which is amazing. It's almost 2 decades on now, so I can imagine the sort of resentment towards it when it launched must have been quite
yes. Well, there
overwhelming.
Was. I mean, we were all interested, of course, and some people positively excited and wanted to use the new medium. But the typical newspaper journalist reaction was, "We're just going to have to do some more work. We're going to have to do all over again what we've done with a few more knobs on, and how can we fit it all in?" Which indeed is what's happened to some extent. It is a problem about doing both. Is you're writing too fast. Never quite been resolved, that problem. But again, so essentially what you thought was, what you particularly didn't think was, this is going to be a permanent thing running all the time, all day. What you thought it would be, you thought it would adapt the paper into online form at certain intervals on each day. Do you see what I mean? So the paper's primary and the internet secondary, and really it's the other way around now, because everything flows obviously first through online, doesn't it?
And as someone who has written extensively about politics in both book form and in the newspapers, and at the Spectator, at the Telegraph, and you forged a career as a polemicist, but also reading coverage of your book, it was praised for its even-handedness. How do you see those things, about writing about politics and having a political stance, about opinion versus news, those strands there? How have you worked that line in your career?
In personal terms, I had a foot in both camps, because I started as a reporter. And when I first did columns, they weren't really viewy columns, they were analytical columns about what's going on in Westminster. And then, of course, also because I was editing, so I was always, I wasn't, for about half my life, I wasn't a columnist, I was an editor. And indeed I was the editor of 3 publications, so I had to constantly decide about what is news, what's a story, what's the best story, and I was spending more time doing that than I was on opinion, though I was always interested in opinion, and I wrote quite a lot of leaders for the papers I edited. So I did always have a foot in both camps, and I hope that this helps when in later life I've been only writing and mainly writing argumentative pieces, because columnists are not so good if they're not rooted in news, because they don't understand it's more difficult for them to interpret what's happening fast, and also they tend to be less good at. News people are well trained in pinning down a fact. And I've often noticed a curious thing that if you get academics to write newspaper journalism, because they think they're sort of at play, all their accuracy that they need for their scholarship disappears, and they make wild assertions which are not backed by exact fact of the day. And I think the reporter background does help with that. And I think it also makes you know the whole idea of a peg in journalism and when to write about what is very important. You can't just write an article which is sort of in the abstract. It has to be arising out of something that's coming up or going on.
And as someone who's also run newspapers, what do you think of the way the Americans do it, where, say, at the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, the opinion department will be literally separated between the news operation, and there wouldn't be that news reporters would be discouraged from expressing political opinions, things like that. What's your view on that?
Well, I feel a bit mixed about that. On the one hand, it's very important that reporters are not the covert mouthpiece of a political position, or indeed the overt mouthpiece of a they should be reporters. But I think a paper ought to have an overall character. And I don't think the opinion people should live in a bubble where they don't relate to the reporters. So I always thought that the paper should be, which is the British model, edited as a whole, but one should try to respect the different roles of the different bits.
Well, who are some of the comment writers that you particularly enjoy reading now, or that you respect?
If
any.
I think Fraser Nelson is extremely good analyst of, as it were, pure politics. He doesn't go range much wider, but I think he's very good at that. I think obviously Matthew Parris is very good in the Times. I think there are a lot of good ones. I don't find that I'm turning to one, who stands head and shoulders above the others. And I think it may have declined a bit in terms of entertainment. There are fewer sort of bravura performers than there were at some points, I think. There's a lot of very decent, intelligent, well-informed columnists, but I don't notice many dominant ones.
Well, I suppose there's a trend for kind of hot takes on things, which can lead to less interesting copy, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, even in the mere print days, you did have to move fast, but obviously now you have to move faster.
Can we talk about, so some of your columns have been divisive, just by the nature of the fact that they're political. One that springs to mind, or two perhaps, of one in defence of Prince Andrew, which actually the headline, as always, is slightly misleading, because actually the body copy is much more nuanced. And then the other one was about Olivia Colman and her left-wing face, for which you got a lot of stick. How do people? You're not on social media. Well, I think you do have a Twitter, but you're not active on it.
I don't do it, no, because I think that I have my work cut out to say things clearly in the newspaper, in columns, and it's a great privilege to be able to do that. And I feel that, for me, the downside would outweigh the advantage of tweeting as well. It just means you pour out more stuff, the quality will probably decline, and you'll be much more punished for the stupid mistake than you will be assisted by the good one. So
how do people get in contact with you if they disagree with you or indeed agree with you?
They put comments on the end of the columns, or they a lot of them seem to get hold of my email somehow or other.
What was the reaction like to the left-wing face?
This would be an example of the different constituencies in this country, because all my regular readers liked it very much and agreed, and was amused, and I say all, but you know what I mean. Many, and then of course others criticise it. Obviously, it's very much a light-hearted thing, and it's supposed to both please and annoy people. So I think it did do both those things.
How would you summarise your own politics, and also in, say, the Thatcher period from '79 to her death, I suppose? How did your own politics evolve during that time?
I came from a liberal background with a capital L. All my family were liberal, active liberals. I became more or less Tory while I was at university. But this was never very closely related to the Conservative Party. I didn't feel loyal to the Conservative Party, but I felt overall Tory in a sort of cultural and political sense. And that, I think, is still the case. In the Thatcher era, I was sort of doing two things at once. One, I was basically trying to defend a broadly Thatcherite position, but also, because my underlying approach was sympathetic, I was actually frequently very critical of her and her government, but from a sort of friendly rather than hostile position, because there are all sorts of things that all governments do which depart from what they say they're going to do, or are less good than they should be, and so on. And I thought it was important, particularly at the Spectator, which is mainly where I was then, to maintain an independent position with a government that we were basically sympathetic to. And by a similar train of thought, when Mrs Thatcher, by this time I was back at the Telegraph, I was deputy editor and I was all doing a column, when Mrs Thatcher started to fall, I was very supportive of her. Because I could see that was the minority position at this point, because people were fed up with her. And so I did a sort of rearguard action defence of her, particularly on the European stuff. And even at the Telegraph, that put me in a minority, because Max Hastings, the then editor, was basically against her, though Conrad Black, the proprietor, was for her. And the sort of drift was anti. And so I think I was probably the only columnist who was really working hard to, try to save her position. This was at the very end.
Have you ever regretted defending someone, or indeed a column or an opinion that you had publicly?
Yes, I have, because sometimes you simply get it wrong. Sometimes, you can be fooled. For example, Jonathan Aitken, who went to prison for perjury, I defended him when he was being attacked. It's a complicated story about why he'd been in the Ritz in Paris, but I thought he was telling the truth, and it turned out that he wasn't, and so I just got it plain wrong. And Jonathan subsequently apologised to me much later. On the whole, I think when it's individuals and you're defending them, I think there's a horrible pack thing that happens now. This is one of the reasons I defended Prince Andrew, when everybody decides to assume the guilt and badness of a particular individual. And there I think it's better to err on the side of naivety and defend them, rather than all pile in and show how righteous you are. And in the case of Prince Andrew, I wasn't defending Prince Andrew as a good and wise man. I was simply saying that he's innocent until proved guilty, and I don't believe that he was lying about the key accusation, which is about the young woman, and I felt that people were absolutely determined to condemn him because they don't like him much, and because he's a prince, and because she's a young woman, and that I just felt the truth needs to be more carefully considered rather than the desire to accuse. And I'd been pursuing a similar thing, well, actually not that similar, but same principle, with Bishop Bell of Chichester, who was condemned by the Church of England 60 years after his death for an alleged paedophile offence, which it seems to me absolutely unproved and I believe to be quite untrue. And again and again, I kept pointing out that the Church had jumped to the conclusion without working out the facts. And eventually they admitted that. They still went on saying that they weren't letting Bell completely off the hook, but they admitted all their processes were wrong. And I think we do have to keep looking out for this, that when people, they rush to judgment about, particularly if the crime is horrifying like paedophilia, you'd think people would be more concerned not to accuse people falsely, because it's such a terrible thing to say about someone. But funnily enough, they're not. They're so horrified by the crime that they wish to find a guilty person, whether that person, and they don't really care whether he is guilty or not. I think that's sort of understandable, but it's also dreadful. And, one of the things a columnist should do is stand out against the rush on one side of anything.
There's still time to apply for the flagship Writing a Novel course at the Faber Academy Creative Writing School.
This week we're giving some more information on a couple of the school's most successful alumni.
S.J. Watson took the first course back in 2009. He says, "You get so many messages that writing is a waste of time and you're never going to get published. And if you do get published, then there's no money in it. I just thought, if I'm going to have a proper stab at this, then I need to give it energy and time."
On the course, he began his domestic noir psychological thriller, Before I Go to Sleep, which went on to become 2011's must-read debut, a global bestseller, and a movie starring Nicole Kidman and Colin Firth.
Chloe Esposito, a former English teacher turned management consultant, took the course back in 2015. The following year, she became the sensation of the London Book Fair when her trilogy, Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know, amassed international advance deals of more than 2 million. Universal is developing the films.
Applications for this iteration of the Faber course close on the 31st of December 2019. For more information, go to faberacademy.co.uk. The course is available in 2 forms, an evening programme involving 1 evening class per week and 1 Saturday per month, alongside a daytime variant which is 1 morning per week, plus an afternoon once per month.
Always Take Notes listeners receive a £250 discount by using the code ALWAYSTAKENOTES2019.
On the royals piece, I was reading another piece online saying that during the travails of Charles and Diana's marriage in the 1980s, you, I believe, told Jeremy Paxman that this should not be reported. And I'm wondering, what is your feeling about that kind of thing? Do you think there are things that lie beyond the remit of journalistic inquiry?
Yes, I do. In that, well, they can be reported if the participants wish to report them, obviously. But obviously, some of this is to do with methods. How do you, for example, if you listen in or if you bug someone, like phone hacking or something like that, it seems to me clear in all normal cases, at least, that you shouldn't do that. Might not be true of when you're pursuing a criminal or something, but similarly, what's in the case of Charles and Diana, it seemed that what was going on was that the press were suborning people to say things, and therefore trying to make trouble between them. What actually emerged eventually was that Diana was had deliberately briefed this chap Andrew Morton, who wrote that book called Diana: Her True Story, and I didn't realise this immediately. It was called Her True Story deliberately, not because it's just a thing you always wish to say that it's true, but because it was the hint that she told him, or that she told him through proxies, actually. And so I was gallantly defending Diana and Charles from intrusion, when actually she had committed the intrusion on herself, if you see what I mean. And I wasn't immediately aware of that.
Just moving to that, but kind of related to start to talk about the book. Could you talk about the idea of authorised biography? So what it is, both in your case, but sort of more generally, and what you think are the advantages, but also the potential complexities of that kind of writing.
I don't know that the phrase authorised necessarily tells you one single thing, but what it meant in my case with Mrs Thatcher was she had decided that it would be a good idea to let someone write her biography, but when I say let, what I mean is that allow that person to see all her papers so that they would be accurately informed, and to get on with the work before the papers were released to the public, which they couldn't be immediately because of what was then the 30-year rule, now a 20-year rule about government paper. So the sense in which she authorised me was she said, would you like to do this? And if you would, I will authorise you to see all my papers, and I will ask the Cabinet Secretary to let you see all the government paper, and I will authorise all the people who work for me to talk to you and my family and so on. And I won't pay you. It's up to you to get a contract with a publisher. And also, I won't control you. I, Margaret Thatcher, will not be allowed to read what you write, and it can't appear in my lifetime. Because otherwise people would have thought this is just her talking through a proxy, like Diana and of course that would have been useless history. So she was very wise to make that suggestion, and it made it much easier for me to accept. So that was the sense in which it was authorised. She had no relationship to the text whatever.
Slightly more flippant question. Gillian Anderson is going to play Margaret Thatcher in The Crown in the next season. Do you watch The Crown?
Yes, I do. I'm a little bit behind on it, so I haven't seen the
third,
part 3.
Yeah. What do you think of it?
Well, I think it's very good, but perhaps containing the seeds of decline in itself. I think it may be in the danger of getting too melodramatic and soapy and slightly losing its moorings from reality.
Well, it's difficult because I was watching the Princess Margaret episode and I was like, God, she said that thing about Kissinger and to Lyndon B. Johnson and kissed him on the lips, and then it turns out it was all fiction.
Yes,
And
I mean, I haven't studied all this.
confused.
I will be more expert about it
Yeah.
when it gets to the Mrs Thatcher stuff. And
Which Gillian Anderson is playing
yes,
Mrs Thatcher.
yes, I've talked to her about it. And
Oh,
I've
have
seen
you?
some of the rushes of it, and I thought she did it brilliantly.
Oh, great. She's brilliant.
Particularly with her Mrs Thatcher in a state of high emotion. I think what none of the actors I've ever seen Mrs Thatcher get is that the way she was quite funny. She was sort of almost camped up her style. She's always played deadly serious, because she was a very serious woman, of course. But there's an element of Mrs Thatcher which is sort of a bit, ooh, you are awful, sort of, almost tapping men with her handbag, sort of semi-flirtatious, almost parodying herself. She used to do that in private, and that I've never seen portrayed. But the basic Thatcher, the earnest, active, anxious leader, working so hard, committing herself so much, arguing so much, being so worried about things, etc. All that is very well done.
Did you watch The Iron Lady?
Yes, I did, and I thought that's a bad film, but a very good portrayal. Very good. So good that I thought there must have been an inside job telling things sometimes about how Mrs Thatcher behaved in private in her old age.
There's a story online that there were 3 writers in the hat, as it were, for the biography, and that she picked you out. Is that true? And do you know who the others were?
I don't really know, because I didn't apply for anything, and there was no shortlister in any formal sense. I've heard other names mentioned, but I actually don't know. What is known, and I mentioned in the book, is that Alan Clark tried to do it. He presented himself as her ghost for her memoirs, but tried to change it into him writing the book.
Was this before his diaries were published?
Yes.
Or,
Yeah. And she was originally amenable to the idea, but then when she realised that he was simply wanting to write a quick biography, she didn't want that. She wanted to write her memoirs, not the biography. Was another day's work several years later. So I don't really know what happened about the biography. All I know is that I was approached. I didn't apply.
And could we talk about process? We always, on the podcast, try to get into the nuts and bolts
Yes.
of how the thing was done. So this took decades, right? I mean, it took...
Yeah, two decades, yeah.
It took a long time.
Yeah.
How... were you working on it full time? What was
No.
what was the mix between interviews and archival material? Did
Yeah.
you have research assistants? Really take us into the
Yeah.
nuts and bolts of how it was done.
Never working full time, because, and in the first years, very, very short amount of time, because I only stopped editing the Telegraph in 2003, having got the signed the contract in 98. So in the first years, I did things like interview her, but I didn't do the basic research. From 2003, my job changed. I left the editorship in order to get on with the book, and I continued on the staff just as a writer. And that's relatively easy to organise the amount of time you need to write the journalism and the book. And so since 2003-04, I've been working continuously hard on the book. And it was 3 volumes. Then I decided it ought to be 2 volumes. Then when I got on to volume 2, I realised it couldn't possibly be 2. It couldn't be contained in 2, so it went back to 3. And I didn't pile them all up. I did one at a time. Important to have one ready for her death, which was, as I say, literally the deadline. And I didn't have a very clear or good method. I simply followed the advice on this point of Simon Heffer, experienced writer, who says there does come, it's sort of rather gnomic remark, but he said there does come a point when you have to start writing. And meaning, don't just pile up research, eventually start writing. And this is good advice, partly because you'd simply forget, but also I think it's only when you're writing that you realise what more research it is you need to do, because you have to answer certain questions when you're writing, and you only realise you have to write them when you are writing. They confront you. You suddenly realise, I don't know about this, or I haven't asked Nigel Lawson about this, or whatever, or I need this document. And so the writing helps direct your research. Though obviously you need to do a lot of research before you do write. And relationship between oral history and the written papers is that the written papers are overwhelmingly more important in explaining, particularly in government, what actually happened and how she did govern. And they're very telling because she writes so much all over the papers, so you can see what she's doing all the time. But of course, the papers don't tell you much about who thought what about whom and all that sort of thing. And they don't really tell you the surrounding stuff about how many other things were going on at the same time, so that, maybe on the day that you're doing the budget, there's also an IRA bomb and a by-election and a state visit by the Emir of Qatar or something. And it could be, and the Prime Minister has to deal with all those things. Also, oral history is phenomenally inaccurate. I mean, all memory is inaccurate, and politicians particularly so, because they're always so busy at the time that they can only remember what they were doing. They can't really take an overview. But it's very valuable because it shows what they felt and what they minded about and what they didn't notice. And so you compare one witness against another, almost like in a court case. So you need, and it's atmospheric as well. So you need this great collection of voices, about 600 people interviewed for the books, as well as the absolutely enormous collection of papers. And the other thing just to say about papers is that, of course, a lot of them turn up later because, as well as the government papers and her papers, people suddenly find they've got private papers, or they tell you that they didn't tell you before that they kept a diary, often very valuable. Or in the case of Mrs Thatcher herself, all these letters she wrote to her sister when she was very young, an absolute treasure trove of the private life that nobody knew about, in the first volume, obviously. And so all these bits compose the whole, and I think to get the tone right, you do need all those different strands.
When she died, how did it affect you on a personal level? Were you affected?
Well, I suppose when she actually died, I was much too busy to think about being affected. I rather spookily, I was on the train and I was correcting the last page of the last proof of volume 1. And of course I knew she wasn't well, but I got off the train and was told she was dead. So I had literally just finished the book as I got off the train. And they decided they were going to publish it really, really fast. So they got it out within 2 weeks, which is quite phenomenal for her. And of course I was asked by the Telegraph and by lots of media to keep talking and writing and so on for journalistic purposes. So it was absolutely flat out. So I didn't really give much personal thought to her until the funeral, or possibly until coming up to the funeral, because I was very incensed by the attempt to insult her body, as it were, by the people who were claiming to burn an effigy, or said they would interrupt the funeral procession, and that made me feel tremendous sort of protectiveness and pity and anger. And then when I was at the funeral, I thought how magnificent it was and how well done. And I always find public ceremonies in a way more moving than just private things. I like the combination of the private knowledge of someone and the public ceremony. I find that very moving. And the whole life comes into focus, and the way she'd come such a long way is very touching, I think, from nowhere to this, and the Queen beside her coffin. And the sense of how much it cost her, and the pain and difficulty, and also the scale of achievement, and the scale of controversy, and all those things. So then that's a powerful mixture of feelings. And also, though I wouldn't claim to know her intimately as human being to human being, I did know her quite well, and I was very grateful to her in her personal dealings with me, because she wasn't the ideal interview subject, because she was always trying to evade questions about herself and so on. But she was very kind and very sort of human. I mean, she could be quite alarming, Mrs Thatcher, but she wasn't snooty. She didn't sort of try to put people down because she was more important than them. She was a very direct person, and she was quite cosy. I mean, she was, quite motherly. Said it was always quite a lot of, you look cold, you must get warmer, or, couldn't you like another bun? Or
where would you have the interviews?
In mainly in her offices, which were nice offices in Chesham Place. And then when she became more frail mentally, and indeed physically, but the relevant point is mentally, I realised it was unfair to subject her to formal interviews anymore. So I used to take her out to lunch at the Savoy or the Goring Hotel or something like that, or sometimes go around to her house and we just chat.
Did you record interviews?
I recorded interviews, but I didn't record the chats.
Right. And
I kept notes of the chats, but I didn't have a tape. That would have intimidated her. I felt at that stage it would have intimidated her.
And with this project of this scale, years in the making, multi-volumes, were you conscious of Robert Caro's work on Lyndon Johnson?
Yes, though I'm ashamed to say I've never read it properly. He's doing, I think, something a bit different. First of all, it's even longer. Secondly,
you finished, which is
yes. Secondly, I finished. But thirdly, I think he's more trying to use it as a way of writing about the whole of America at that time. And while, of course, I do wish to get the atmosphere right in the Thatcher book, in order to organise the material, I'm not writing a history of her government. I am writing a biography of her throughout her life. So I do try to keep the focus on her. I hope I get the wider atmosphere, but you must keep the focus on here. And I had an interesting correspondence with Hilary Mantel about this, because she said, you and I are doing something slightly similar, though mine's fiction, because we've always got the same person in the room. I think it's literally true in her case, and it's not absolutely literally true in mine, because there are occasions when she's not in the room, like when Geoffrey Howe's plotting with Lawson or something like that. But basically, it's true. And so this very, very closely focused, lifelong encounter with your subject.
After she died, was there anything that you realised you hadn't asked her and you'd meant to?
Well, lots. But you have to remember that it might not be so important in a way, because Mrs Thatcher was very evasive in interview answers, because she didn't like talking about this. She was obviously an egotist, like all great people. She didn't really like talking about herself, so she'd always try to jump the rails and start talking about general things like, the recovery of Britain, or why communism's bad, or how to control inflation.
What was the question she evaded?
She didn't like anything personal, so she didn't like anything about her family, her marriage, her children, what she thought of other individuals, or her inner life. She actually did sometimes say things about this, but you couldn't. If the harder you press, the less you got. So it would more come out in sideways conversations. And she was so practiced at political interviews on television that she treated my interviews like that, though of course they weren't. But she would behave as if she were on telly, and sort of start wanting to have a fight, really, and hitting back all the time.
Did you ever have a proper fight?
Well, she'd get very heated sometimes, and it was always to do with my trying to find out too much. I don't mean that she was trying to hide a guilty secret. She wasn't that sort of person. She just didn't. Self-analysis, or the analysis of people close to her, was something she didn't enjoy. So she would just deliberately be unfair in order to derail me. So she might say something like, "You only say that because you're a socialist," or something like that, just to get me out, just push me away from whatever track I was going down.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it relates to people's writing lives. And there's a few bits of this that I wanted to talk about. So the first was your career as a journalist and an editor in the 80s and the 90s. How did both what you were being paid and what you were later able to pay people compare to how the scenario is now? And then secondly, when you were writing the book, this project that took so long, how did you sustain yourself, your income? What fraction of it was from the book? What fraction from other work? Things like that.
I haven't calculated the fraction, but what I would generally say about the advance is it's a big advance, but also the worst paid thing per hour work that I've ever done, because of the absolutely colossal amount of work. And also, I paid researchers. I've started off with only one researcher because I felt I must look at all the British papers myself and see what they were like and go right through them. But I quickly realised I had to employ someone in the United States because there's a massive amount there, and I simply couldn't do both. I just could not fit all that in. And I employed this marvellous man, Daniel Collings, who did about sort of 98% of the primary research in America, and most of the interviews. He's just brilliant. And we worked harmoniously together all the way through. And he didn't write any of the book. He didn't even in a preliminary sense. I wrote 100% of it. But his work on the American stuff was fantastic. That's quite expensive to employ somebody all those years to do that. And then in later years, I employed in a less general capacity, a less commanding capacity, other researchers, including mainly one called David Shields, who's an excellent, mainly expert on Northern Ireland, but also resident in Cambridge and could look at things there in the Churchill Archive, where a lot of Thatcher papers are. Where her papers are. And so I was not making a loss on the book, but not making much of a profit. And so I sustained myself by continuing as a journalist all this time. And if I'd only worked on the book, despite its success and decent advance, I would be struggling to survive financially.
Now, to finish off, because I know you've got to dash away in a few minutes, looking back at your editorship of the Telegraph, what would you say was your greatest success?
What I was trying to do all the time was I feel the editor should care very much about the overall character of the paper. And I think one of the difficult things about the online age is how hard that is to do, because you've got such a sort of massive spread of identity because of the spread of media. I felt I could give it an identity, and I was very admiring of the traditional Telegraph, that's to say a sort of very news-based, serious newspaper, but I felt that it could be livened up and modernised in that way, and made more controversial, because though it was very conservative in its party allegiance tradition, it was rather averse to controversy and to fun. It was very plain fare, and I thought you could maintain most of the authority while getting more originality, controversy and humour into it. And I think on the whole that did succeed, and this also succeeded in layout terms and that sort of thing. If you think of innovations in the great days of the Saturday paper, when it was so strong and we were able to develop new supplements all the time and present things much better than in the past and use modern technology to have much better photographs. It was unbelievably bad use of photographs in the old days, that sort of thing. So I would say, in my mind, I suppose, it's fundamentally a Victorian concept, and I mean that in a good way, but adapted to the 21st century, so that it was both old and new, sort of an interesting project in that way.
Well, Charles, thank you very much for coming on to Always Take Notes, and your final volume in your Thatcher biography is out now.
Thank you very much. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.
Hello, it's us again. We have some news on the podcast, which is that Ellie, who has been the co-host of Always Take Notes for a year,
in case you hadn't noticed,
is stepping back. Ellie, it's very sad to see you go.
Yes, it's been very fun. It's been a delight. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
And I will be listening every 2 weeks as a devoted fan, of course.
And can you say a bit about your new project that you're going to do?
Yes, so I am... I've just launched a music podcast called Straight Up, which kind of lifts the lid on the music industry by talking to everyone from like the hottest publicist in the UK to the most, let's say, ubiquitous photographer to kind of the biggest manager in the scene right now, and talking about the stars, the biggest musicians in the charts according to them. So the inside lane.
Where can people find that if they'd like to listen to it?
Wherever you get your podcasts. And there are some pretty incendiary anecdotes this week about Prince William.
Yeah, but this is because you drink while you're talking to your guests.
Yeah, every interview is conducted over several drinks, so by the end of it, they're totally loose-lipped. And we often have little emails after us being like, could we just edit that out? Which we don't.
And it's called Straight Up?
And it's called Straight Up.
And it's available now?
And it's available now, and it's on our 3rd week. So quite different to Always Take Notes, but journalistic and quality and integrity is still the same.
Always. Well, look, Ellie, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show,
Simon.
And wishing you all the best with everything going forward. And there is a new co-host who shall be introduced in the next episode.
Big surprise.
We need to still do the normal stuff, right?
Oh yeah, we do need to say that was a great interview with Charles.
Yes, very interesting.
Who is actually my colleague.
Yes, that's true. I was going to say that we needed to say this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Akam, and for the last time.
And for the last time, Eleanor Hall. Charles Moore was my swan song.
He was your swan song. Our producer is Nicola Keane. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar. And if you've enjoyed the show, you can find us on social media. We are on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Facebook and Instagram.
I haven't left yet, and you've already nicked my bit.
We share
both
this
bits. No, you just did both. As if I'd
I was
already gone.
Okay, you can have Instagram. Where are we on Instagram?
Take Notes Always. Bet you didn't even know that.
No, that's Twitter.
Yes.
It was such a graceful departure. And
Sorry.
if you've enjoyed the show, we are on Patreon. No, we haven't said that.
You have just said that.
No.
Oh no, sorry. You said rate and review and subscribe.
If you've enjoyed the show, we're on Patreon at Always Take Notes. Anyway, Ellie, it's been a great pleasure, and wishing you all the best with your next ventures.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, listeners.